Hi, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the most bizarre and embarrassing moments in comics from the 90s, which is certainly the most bizarre period of comic book history. Number 10. Dubious fashion. One of the major problems of comics in the 90s was the hypersexualization of female characters. Very short clothes, huge necklines, and totally disproportionate anatomies were normal in the comics of that decade. The most absurd case was that of the Invisible Woman, Sue Storm, who at that time received a completely different uniform from her Fantastic Four teammates. The outfit was almost like the girl's powers, practically invisible, having the neckline in the shape of the number 4 of the team's uniforms. In addition to being short and uncharacteristic, the outfit was considered a disrespect to one of the oldest characters in comics, who decidedly did not need an appealing look to stand out. Other characters like Emma Frost and Sarah Pezzini, Witchblade, were also marked by this type of approach. At the time, male characters also began to suffer from disproportionate shapes, gaining layers and layers of muscle. At one point, it felt like the artists were competing to see who could put the most muscle into their characters. Sure enough, the winner of that bizarre contest was the character Prime from Malibu Comics, which was later purchased by Marvel. Prime is the purest definition of 90s hype. We also can't help but remember perhaps the most infamous image of that entire era, Rob Liefeld's version of Captain America. Poor Captain. Number 9. Heroes on vacation. Another embarrassing problem with comics in the 90s was the absence of important characters. Publishers pulled established characters out of circulation without having any plans for the future of their comics. In the 90s, we had Superman dead, Batman was out of action after his confrontation with Bane, and even Wonder Woman was called back home, away from the eyes of the world. DC believed that the older characters were worn out and decided to create new versions for their best-known heroes. Well, it wasn't a good idea. The problem was not these stories, but the sequels to them. Superman, for example, had 4 different replacements and none of them were well accepted by fans. Diana Prince was called to Paradise Island, where she lost her title to her rival, Artemis, when Queen Hippolyta organized a contest to choose who should fill the role of emissary to the outside world. Artemis won the competition and became the new Wonder Woman. Batman's case was even worse. In the early 90s, some of Marvel's characters like Wolverine and the Punisher were stealing the spotlight from Batman. Fans were tired of Bat's policy of never taking a life. They wanted blood. So Denny O'Neil decided to bring an ultra-violent Batman to face the competition. Thus, when Bane snapped Bruce Wayne's spine, the Bat chose a replacement, Jean-Paul Valley, who had his own psychological problems. He even started off well, but eventually went crazy and started killing indiscriminately. And that armor of his was really horrible. Sales of Batman comics dropped and Bruce Wayne soon had to go back to being Batman. Some things shouldn't be messed with. Number 8. Retcon, retcon, and more retcon. As we commented just now, the biggest thing in 90s was killing off great characters. What's more, the little ones didn't escape either. The thing is, due to the lack of creativity of some writers, nobody knew what to do with the comics after the death of those big guys. The solution was to do a retcon, or several. Virtually no story had consequences in the 90s. Characters died in a comic and were brought back in the next issue. It got to the point where practically all the heroes of the 2 big publishers had already walked through the world of the dead at least once. The most absurd case happened after the death of Avengers and the Fantastic Four at the hands of the villain Onslaught. Shortly after that, Marvel released the comic Heroes Reborn, which brought everyone back in a new, much more 90s style. Remember Rob Liefeld's Captain America? Yeah, he belongs to Heroes Reborn. Soon, Marvel realized that Heroes Reborn was a mistake. To fix the mistake, guess what they did? Yes, a new retcon. After the failure of Heroes Reborn, Marvel returned with the teams as they were before, as if nothing had happened in yet another show of lack of consequences. Something that resulted from this movement was the creation of several alternative universes. From that point on, several characters existed in different versions simultaneously in different universes, which caused many fans to be completely lost. Number 7. Everyone wanted to be Image. In the 90s, a third player hit the comic book market and brought down the house. Image Comics was a publisher that had the likes of Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane in its ranks. They made more violent comics with extravagant heroes, lots of weapons, chains, and armor everywhere. They were responsible for releasing fantastic characters such as Spawn, Gen 13, and Wildcats. The problem is that seeing the success of the new competitor, Marvel and DC decided that all their main characters had to adapt to the Image style in order to surf the hype and not lose readers. This genius plan had everything to go wrong, don't you think? And it really did. Bruce Wayne has given way to Jean-Paul Valley with that grotesque armor and murderous thirst. Wolverine had all the adamantium in his body excised by Magneto, and because of that he began to regress to a primitive and animalistic state. Superman, who had already died earlier in the decade, took another hit in 1997 when he developed abilities based on electrical energy by being temporarily deprived of solar energy. He then had to wear a blue and white containment suit to stop the energy from dispersing, and this look was so booed by readers that it only lasted 13 issues. And Wonder Woman left the traditional uniform and started to wear a leather jacket with biker shorts and a black bra. However, the character who suffered the most from Image's influence suffered so much that he became an item here on our list. Number 6. Poor Frank Castle. If there was a hero who suffered from it all in the 90s, it was the Punisher. Of all the Marvel characters, he was the one who most fit with the Image comic style and therefore began to appear everywhere at this time. There was no Marvel comic without the Punisher. Another factor that helped a lot in a hyper-exposure of the character was the live-action adaptation he received in 1989, being played by Dolph Lundgren. Watch at your own risk. By the end of the 90s, Frank Castle had 2 comics in addition to frequent appearances in several other comics. In one of his solo arcs to bring the character closer to the origin of Spawn, from Image, Frank Castle takes his own life, but is brought back as an angel of death, some kind of zombie that judges and executes the bad guys. Obviously, the story was rejected by the fans and soon everything went back to normal. That infamous story was never mentioned again. Poor Frank. What did they do to you? Number 5. 2099 Everywhere. Spider-Man 2099 was created by Peter David in 1992 and is one of the coolest versions of Spider-Man. Miguel O'Hara is a scientist from 2099 who recreated the spider venom that gave Peter Parker his powers, becoming the Spider-Man of his reality. The story was so successful that it is referenced to this day. Turns out in comics, when something goes right, people just don't know when to stop. And because the era's over-the-top cyberpunk aesthetic was everywhere, everyone ended up getting their own 2099 version. In addition to the Punisher who we just talked about, we had Thor, Hulk, Ghost Rider, Black Panther, Doctor Doom, X-Men, and Fantastic Four 2099. Everyone won a 2099 edition. Unfortunately, the other characters' stories weren't as cool as Miguel O'Hara's stories, but it was the 90s, nobody really cared. Number 4. The symbiotes are here. Following the same path of the previous item and also coming out of the Spider-Man stories, if there was a fever even bigger than that of the 2099 comics, it was the symbiote fever. Venom and Carnage gained a huge proportion in Spidey comics in the 90s. After all, everyone was looking to see brutal characters with very little sense of morality. The symbiotes were just perfect in that context. The stories featuring them began to be so well received that Marvel understood that they should be explored further. The problem is that because they weren't really such complex characters, they still didn't hold a comic alone, at least at that time. So what Marvel did was turn the two into protagonists in Spider-Man comics, leaving poor Peter Parker as a supporting character in his own comic book. Obviously, this overexposure wasn't as well received by fans, and soon Spidey, who had much more depth, got rid of the two to follow his adventures. Over the years, Venom and Carnage returned, much better developed, with much more complex scripts. One of the last great Marvel arcs in comics was the King in Black saga, which introduced the symbiote god, Null, and is very much worth checking out. This saga contains many important elements about the origin of the Klynthar race. But that's a conversation for another video. Number 3. The infamous Clone Saga. After the resounding sales success of Death of Superman and Nightfall, Marvel came up with their answer. The Clone Saga, which promised to be the greatest arc of Spider-Man comics, and indeed it was, for a while. The arc reused a story from the 70s in which Spider-Man had a clone created by the villainous Jackal. In that story, the clone sacrificed himself to save Ned Leeds and was never mentioned again until the 90s. In the Clone Saga, we discover that the clone survived and contained all of Peter Parker's memories, keeping himself away for 20 years. Upon learning that Aunt May was very ill, he finally returns and confronts Peter. Like every crossover, they fight each other and become allies in the end. The clone was renamed Ben Reilly, the Scarlet Spider. So far so good. The new Spider was very well received and the story was a success, showing a physical and psychological struggle for Peter Parker and introducing us to a new super captivating character with an incredible design. The problem here was the same as always, people don't know when to stop. The saga, which was supposed to last 6 months, continued to be produced for more than 3 years. Yes, 3 long years. Marvel was in dire financial straits, the role of editor-in-chief was changing all the time, and consequently, so were the creative decisions. In the end, Marvel tried to convince readers that Ben Reilly was the real Spider-Man, and Peter, who fans had always known, was the clone created in the 70s. The clone lived as Peter Parker for 20 years until he was convinced he was the real Peter Parker. So Peter returned the mantle to Ben, who became the only Spider-Man in that universe. Of course, fans hated this resolution and everything had to be scrapped. After a series of confusing storylines and in-arc retcons, we ended up discovering that it was all Norman Osborn's fault. An easy solution to a very complicated problem. In the end, Peter reverted to being the original Spider-Man and Ben Reilly sacrificed himself, appearing again in Spider-Man's multiverse stories. What a mess. Number 2. Oh yes, the crossovers. In a time of crisis in comics, with Marvel declaring bankruptcy and DC also far from their glory days, the two publishers decided to do a crossover so that their heroes could exchange some punches. Batman vs. Captain America, Superboy vs. Spider-Man, Storm vs. Wonder Woman, and even Lobo vs. Wolverine were some of the clashes in the series DC vs. Marvel, the conflict of the century. You see, clashes between the greatest heroes of the world's two greatest comic book publishers. Amazing, isn't it? Not so much. In the end, the stories did not go beyond fan service, a very weak plot for the clash of the two universes and very dubious results of these fights. Don't worry, it gets even worse. In the incessant stubbornness of not knowing when to stop, Marvel and DC created the Amalgam Universe, in which the heroes became hybrids of DC and Marvel characters, created by the Living Tribunal and the Spectre. From there came Dark Claw, Spider-Boy, and even Lobo, the Duck. A mix of characters who were only good at design, unfortunately. Well, it was worth the try. Number 1. The variant covers. Probably nothing represents the thinking of comic book publishers in the 90s more than comic book covers. With the drop in sales and the beginning of the publishing crisis, one of the solutions thought of by Marvel and DC was to do something different on the covers. Hence the holographic covers, variants, highlighted the glow in the dark, and even with stickers that could be removed and reused. All this to attract the attention of the reader, who was no longer so interested in the stories. Among the weirder covers, we have Daredevil number 321, which glows in the dark, and the classic Silver Surfer number 100, with a psychedelic hologram cover. The stories themselves aren't really a big deal, but there's no denying that the covers draw a lot of attention, and they also brought a few extra bucks to the publishers. Even though it's a time so full of ups and downs, we can't help but miss the glorious excesses of the 90s. Don't you agree? Subscribe to the channel so you can watch many more videos like this one. And as always, thanks for watching.